I want to clarify that yes, I'm aware that purchasing the Rockstars is not required. I said this in the last video, but I want to reiterate. We also never see William take the parts or have any clear indication he took the parts in the original animatronic. That is an event that is entirely hypothetical and off-screen. It is the same damn argument to say, oh, Henry just has the Rockstars there and we just don't see him or are explicitly told he put them there. Versus, oh, we just aren't told or explicitly shown William took all those parts off screen. It just feels very hypocritical to say one is fine to let slide, but the other isn't. And that's one of two major flaws that I noticed, whereas the 10 minutes of noticeable frustrating flaws that MoltenMCI had in that same video. So a lot of people tried to break down my Henry interpretation by just saying it's wrong and saying, when it talks about small souls trapped in prisons of my making now set to a new purpose and used in ways I never thought imaginable, it's talking about the MCI kids being used in unimaginable ways as the fun times. The issue is the designated purpose for the fun time is killing kids, presumably to get remnant, which he already has from the MCI kids by this logic. So in this very counter argument to support MoltenMCI, you create a fallacy with MoltenMCI if you're saying this is what it's for. Because that implies William, instead of just using that remnant for whatever he wants to use remnant for, he just strangles a bunch of new toddlers with his robots powered by the old toddler. Why? Not only is that the most narratively puzzling and bizarre-ass way to explain a story or plot point, but it's completely unnecessary fundamentally in the first place. But more importantly, this is entirely debunked by the simple phrasing of the sentence. Small souls trapped in prisons of my making. Remember, this is Henry talking, so he's saying they're still trapped, or at least in this moment he's talking about, were trapped in his costumes, his suit, which are the classic animatronics. At that point, either you're arguing Henry made the sister location animatronics, or in the moment he's talking about where they're being used in unimaginable ways, they're still the classic animatronic. You know what explanation that totally fits with, even with MoltenMCI? That he's talking about the original kids using their costumes, the prisons they were trapped in, to get revenge on people who they think is William. That explanation works for both, for really any theory or interpretation, and makes sense in the context and order of events and way things are explained, because he's not talking about them being dismantled yet. So in the context, he's still talking about them as the original characters. A lot of people were asking what my interpretation of the fun times are, because they are clearly possessed. I'm not going to argue they aren't possessed. Would be without MoltenMCI, like this is the only way to explain how they'd be possessed. But do I need to remind people that all of the fun times have a way to kill kids? Baby's got her stomach claw, Freddy's got a stomach tank to have kids in, and he also has voice mimicking. He's got like elusive sense and also parents' voice playback. Ballora has music and something called deter and misdirect, whatever the hell that's for. And Baby specifies that the spring-lock suit in her old pizzeria was used in some unintended way, which could imply spring-lock failure. Or what I think that suit was used for, because it doesn't move, it doesn't act possessed, and we never see it in any other context, which implies it's not active at all. It's not possessed by any dead kid or dead person who wore it. Is that William wore that costume to kill the kids lured by Ballora and Foxy, and probably hide them in Freddy's stomach tank. And that Baby was meant to capture all the kids or any kid who was left on their own that was available while everyone else was distracted with the others. This further plays into the line that Baby has about how she's been out before but is always put back in her shell, which seems to imply to me that the point of the scooper was, we'll take all of the parts that are possessed out, we'll study them, we'll experiment with the remnant, try to figure out what's going on, we'll put it all back and just have them run for whatever purpose. And that's the way the fun times are meant to be used. The problem was that Baby killed the wrong kid. She wasn't meant to kill Elizabeth, she was meant to kill some random schmuck skid. To me, this is the best fitting explanation because it aligns the most with how Sister Location portrays the fun times. It creates a sort of parallel but unique story arc to what the MCI kids went through. I want to go into another video at a separate date about how Baby's character is almost the perfect inverted mirror of Charlie's character as being the opposite and foil to her. I will admit there was one counterpoint I thought that was actually pretty alright, which is saying that Golden Freddy counts as one suit in animatronic as part of the Meltdown 5, as opposed to the spirits inside of it, which I do think is a fair defense. Like I said with the whole bit of like, oh, shaking Afton down for his lunch money, it's kind of hard to assume that any spirits inside of Golden Freddy would let themselves be dismantled in the first place. Now, a lot of people were asking, how would Golden Freddy get to 6's fire without MoltenMCI? Well, I think there are explanations from UCN specifically. The phrasing, "no matter how many times they burn us," implies Golden Freddy has been burned multiple times, which becomes really weird if they're Molten Freddy, because they've been burned once in Henry's Fire. So unless they were lurking around in FNAF 3 when we just didn't see, I don't buy it. And I think the survival logbook gives us a little bit of a better insight to how this would work, that they're either following Mike around, or maybe even attached to William himself. That would explain this whole "they burned us" as if they're together or attached or in the same scenario. It would also explain if they're attached to Mike instead, and it would explain why they're so intertwined with this whole logbook thing. To me, MoltenMCI raises questions if the explanation is that's how they get to FNAF 6. Unless you're retconning that FNAF 3 has Molten Freddy in it somewhere, this line doesn't make any sense. Plus, in Fazbear Fright, they make this big deal of Andrew being attached to William and haunting him. And that's the direct parallel to UCN, which further implies that's how this works, but I mean, that's the whole thing to itself. I just wanted to bring it up that that's another example of this whole idea of spirits attaching to things or clinging on to things. I think the things that really pinned RockstarMCI, maybe want me to include it into this whole original video, is the fact that Golden Freddy's gravestone, or the hypothetical gravestone that Golden Freddy would be in, is obscured, but the 5 others aren't. Yeah, there are multiple meanings to this, but they haven't moved on. Scott wanted to save the name reveal for the survival logbook, but it could also mean that they weren't part of the group anymore. They went off on their own. Charlie and her other 4 were freed, but whoever this extra character is wasn't. And what visual did Scott give for "it's time for you and all the spirits you have carried in your arm"? The puppet and the 4 MCI kids without Golden Freddy visible, despite the fact that he is in this scene. The same character roster as the gravestone ending. And Scott has renders of Molten Freddy burning, so it doesn't make sense to not show that visual here if we're trying to confirm MoltenMCI. Why would he not show Molten Freddy here if that's the story we're telling? And to sort of cover my evidence a little bit more for the whole Faz fact thing, because a lot of people were questioning if that really is canon. Scott, while he didn't specifically say the Faz facts themselves were canon, he said unreleased info and the data mine stuff was canon. And I see no reason this complete intact stuff wouldn't be canon, but every email and other thing that wasn't released was. And pretty much all of them have genuinely interesting things, or at least funny comments about the lore in them. Their original animatronics featured spring-lock suits that could be cranked to allow them to be worn safely by employees. This confirms the spring-lock suits are the original costumes, and that there is no normal Bonnie or Fredbear before the spring-lock one. The first location of Freddy's franchise was Fredbear's Family Diner, and this confirms that the franchise does start with Fredbears. In 1993, the most dangerous profession in the United States was actually a night security guard. Fazbear's Twisted Pizza recipe was voted most yummy by 6 out of 10 children in every survey from 1988 to 1993. Those 2 Faz facts confirm that FNAF 1 was opened between 1988 and 1993, and closed in that later year. Or at the very least, it was around with quality pizza until 1993. Despite the name, hurricanes are not actually the leading cause of death in children in Hurricane, Utah. Confirms that the FNAF games are in fact set in Hurricane, which was never really specified. We knew it was in Utah from the court legal stuff and being sued in 6, but it was never explicitly stated that it was Hurricane. The famous William Afton is responsible for the creation of the animatronics we all know and love. Some of the first animatronics built by William Afton featured claw mechanisms that were able to hide away items inside them. These 2 facts are a bit more loaded, but they do confirm that William did in fact build the Funtimes himself, and the normal cast are still his characters and brand. I'm sure you could make an argument that this means that William built the Funtimes first, and those are the original animatronics, but that contradicts the whole Springlock suits being first fact, and more importantly to me, I feel like this is talking about this kind of propaganda angle, because it specifies the famous William Afton, which implies that this Faz fact is trying to paint William as he's like your icon, he's Walt Disney kind of thing. Which, given that a lot of the AR emails are all about things being hacked and manipulated and things being altered by Glitchtrap, is totally in character for him to write Henry out of the history of the franchise. The only Faz fact that doesn't have any explicitly interesting lore connections is Chica's Cupcake features a unique set of servos and its own independent suite of software, which just seems to confirm the cupcake can move on its own as seen in Help Wanted. The phrasing "developed from the original Bonnie" is so weird. What the fuck would that mean otherwise? I don't think it's trying to explain that he just looks like the original Bonnie, because I feel like they would have just said it. Rockstar Bonnie is based on the original Bonnie. That's the more natural way to explain it, but they say developed from the original Bonnie. I've seen a lot of people say like, oh, Henry's dialogue doesn't make sense without MoltenMCI. What does this mean without RockstarMCI? And God, I can't believe I have to say this again. This is unused information from other pools of unused information that are confirmed canon in a canon game, as opposed to the Silver Eyes trilogy, which was never confirmed to be canon or meant to be used for the games. At least in the like stupid general way where it's like, everything's canon, but it's like to its own universe. But in terms of connecting to the games, Silver Eyes has never been meant to connect that way. Scott explicitly said it is not meant to be used to solve lore. AR was! And if AR says something, even if it's unused, if other things are unused to confirm to be canon, why wouldn't we use this stuff? Why would we instead prioritize information from the Silver Eyes trilogy? There are variants of MoltenMCI or other similar theories that work with fewer errors but also fewer evidence. I think the best way I've seen it explained is Raito's MoltenDCI, which really should be called MoltenMCI 2, because it basically implies that the toy animatronics use the parts of the original animatronics, which make them possessed, and then when they're scrapped, those possessed parts from the original animatronics become the fun time. That does fix a lot of the chronological issues with dislocation that MoltenMCI creates, but it just feels like it falls on a lot of pitfalls that MoltenMCI has, but it's not a bad way to work around it. As I stand by, MoltenMCI is a good theory anyway, so an improved or altered version of it is not a problem itself. Then again, an actual MoltenDCI where it's about the deaths of the Scatter Kids and save them would finally make that minigame relevant when it really hasn't been ever since it came out. If a puzzle piece fits with a few connections and you find, hey, some other sets from the same producers fit this piece and we can kind of cheat our way to getting a little more progress done, do you complete the puzzle with that despite how janky and jarring it looks, just for the sake of saying you completed the puzzle? Or do you complete it the way it was meant to be completed, or find a way that at least fits all the pieces from the original set? I'd say you do the latter rather than just focusing on actually fitting pieces together. MoltenMCI is focusing on fitting pieces together rather than looking at the whole picture it would paint. Part of the reason I wanted to make the whole RockstarMCI thing was I felt like MoltenMCI created too many problems to justify its belief. It has its issues, but I don't see any issues that aren't general FNAF issues. It's a little bit of a trap, to be honest, because to debunk RockstarMCI, you kind of have to admit that these flaws also exist in MoltenMCI. And I wanted people to at least question why they were supporting this theory if they have the same issues with another similar theory. I guess I was a little bit frustrated that people would take every possible angle to explain certain characters, especially like Noel and Freddy, and try to look at them from any possible way they haven't been looked at before to explain the dumbest and smallest of inconsistencies. But when there's genuinely a lot of frustration and issues with MoltenMCI and the timeline and how it treats things, people have said, nah, that's basically canon and we have to work around it. I feel like discrediting that focus wasn't enough. I had to bring a new alternative to it. Despite the name, hurricanes are not the leading cause of children in youth.